Okay, I've got that it's 2 o'clock, so why don't we go ahead and get started. This is the Remembering Rothbard panel. So Murray Rothbard, of course, is one of the giants of all sorts of fields. Austrian economics and political or libertarian political theory would be, his 2 main areas and what he's known for. But as I'll let these guys explain more and fill in some of the details, Rothbard really was just contributed to all sorts of fields. If he had just been an economic historian, like he would be remembered as a very good economic historian for his contributions on, panics in U.S. history. He wrote a book, America's Great Depression, that was one of the original book that overturned the myth of Herbert Hoover being a real laissez-faire guy, and that's why the Great Depression was so bad. Rothbard just blows that up. So all sorts of things he did. Like I said, I'll defer to these guys. I never met Rothbard personally, and so since we kind of want this not just to be stuffy and academic, but also to give a sense of him personally, that's why I'm going to my role just to keep things moving. So just so you guys know, we'll pass the mic down and you just give some introductory remarks about your experience with Rothbard and what people need to know who might not be familiar with him, and I'll just give you a signal if you've hit 10 minutes, so we leave time for them at the end. If you do want to know what I think of him, I had written the introduction to the second version or edition of Making Economic Sense. So if you Google Rothbard Making Economic Sense PDF, you'll get the free thing from the Mises Institute. And I had a short little essay in the beginning there talking about my interpretation of his contributions. But like I said, these guys knew him personally, so why don't we go ahead and just let them get going.
Okay, I'll start. My name's Doug French, and I had the distinct pleasure, by pure serendipity, of studying under Murray Rothbard. And I didn't know who he was. I moved to Las Vegas in 1986. It turns out that Murray moved there the same year with Hans Hermann Hoppe, and they took positions at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. I had moved to town just to try to find a job and thought it might be a better place to find a job than Topeka, Kansas, where I had been. I ended up being right about that. And I had been there a couple of years, and I decided to go to UNLV, decided to pursue a master's in economics, took a couple classes, and then I was looking at the course catalog and noticed a class, I believe it was 742, History of Economic Thought, instructor Rothbard. I asked one of my fellow classmates, his name is Joel Volpe, I said, do you know this Rothbard guy? What do you think this class will be like? And he said, do not take him. Rothbard is a kook, he's crazy, and you can take this class independent study with someone else. Well, I was working at the time, and I didn't want to fool around with all that, so I just went ahead and enrolled, and the rest is history, shall we say. I remember the first night he walked in, a gentleman by the name of James Philbin, who I think most people on the stage at least know, was a student of his who had come to UNLV purely for the reason to study under Rothbard, but James Philbin was carrying his chair behind him. And Murray walked in with a pocket full of pens, and the minute he hit the door, he started talking. There was no get himself settled, there was no take roll, there was no hand out a syllabus. He just started talking, and he was talking about, this was the first Gulf War, and he was talking about those crazy politicians. There were gas lines at the time, and those crazy politicians that wanted to ration gas or whatever was going on. But he immediately just launched into his economic thought discussion, and I just saw people furiously taking down notes. So I did the same thing, which was almost impossible to do because he went so fast. It was almost like a Robin Williams monologue. It just went along that fast, and if you can imagine, with a number of references thrown in, the average, if I look back over my notes, I'll see that there was 5 or 6 reading references at least in every class period. But I took Rothbard for that class. I took him for U.S. economic history, and it ended up that I wrote my thesis under him. And he encouraged me to get part of that thesis published in a mainstream journal. I tried 7 or 8 times to do that and failed. They all turned it down. We eventually, after he died, the journal, Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, published it, and now it's being cited various places. Little work I did on tulip mania. But he was just an absolute, he was just a good guy more than anything. As much of an intellectual giant that he was just a great guy. In fact, I had no idea how lucky I was. I never had him sign an autograph. I never had my picture taken with him. He only autographed one thing that I have, and that's my thesis. And so I wish I had a photo with him, but you know, to me, he was just this great guy. I would wait for hours in the hallway at Beam Hall at UNLV to talk to him. And in fact, there were a number of us that would do that. There was no chair, so you would sit down on the floor, and there would be 3 or 4 of us lined up waiting to talk to him during office hours. Eventually, the market worked. Chairs started to appear in front of Murray's office. And you would go in and talk about anything. It might be soap operas. It might be college basketball. It could be anything. He would ask as many questions of you as you would of him. The other point I'd like to make, because I've been asked a few times during the course of the last few days about these various splits that Rothbard had with various other libertarians. And I can tell you that with me, he had a blank slate. I didn't know who Ayn Rand was. I didn't know who this one was. I didn't know who that one was. And when I asked him what I should be reading, he told me, read The Fountainhead, read Atlas Shrugged, buy your books from Laissez Faire Books, buy your books from Liberty Fund, all these groups that I find out later supposedly he was on the outs with. Well, I never heard him say a negative word about any of these people. And so he was very giving of his time. He was very giving of his opinion. He was a funny, funny guy. He's been described as the best guy in the world to go have a drink with, and I think that's absolutely true. I'm sure you're going to hear some stories about him holding court until 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the morning. He was very much a night owl. So he would have fit in at Porcfest in some ways, in the nocturnal ways. He would have fit in very well. You know, an early speech for Murray is, 2 or 3 in the afternoon. But he would write 20 pages a night on a typewriter. First blast out of the cannon, it would be incredible, incredible material. So I feel quite lucky that, I was touched somewhat by this greatness. I didn't take advantage of it like I should have, but we did correspond even after I left UNLV, and he continues to be an inspiration for me to this day.
Thank you, Doug. When I was in high school, I had read Ayn Rand. I was more or less a Cold War conservative. I didn't know anything about libertarianism. And then later on, there was a split at the Young Americans for Freedom, which was a conservative group by, under the aegis of Bill Buckley. And the libertarians broke away from the traditionalists. And that was the first time that the term libertarian came to me, or I noticed the term. And it pointed out that they were more consistent in the article I was reading, in the sense that they were against the drug war, as well as against leftist intervention to the economy. So I became very interested in libertarianism. When I got to college, I wanted to take economics. I had read Adam Smith in my senior year in high school, so I always sort of knew from that point on I wanted to be an economist. And so I was very interested in economics, but the courses I had principles of macroeconomics, and I had macroeconomics, and it was during that period that we were having a big inflation because of the Vietnam War. Not caused by the Vietnam War, of course, but caused by the Fed financing the war by printing up money. And so the macroeconomics courses I had didn't serve the purpose of giving me any information as to why this was occurring. And then one day, I read an article in the New York Times review of books, or New York Times Magazine, which was a weekly magazine of all places, and it had the picture of two students on there, a Columbia law student and a Columbia undergraduate, and they had their fists raised, and then it had libertarianism, a right-wing alternative, or something like that. So I read the article, and at the end, they mentioned the Austrian School of Economics and Murray Rothbard. And I had never heard of the Austrian School of Economics. So at that point, the first time I heard Rothbard's name, I was a junior in college. And I happened to mention this to some of the conservative students I hung around with at Young Americans for Freedom. And one of them produced a small pamphlet called Depression Causes and Cure. It was by Rothbard. And he said, well, here, why don't you take a look at this? And I read it in 45 minutes. The next day I read it, and it told me more about the causes and remedies for depressions, recessions, business cycles than I had learned up to that point in 2 years of academic economics. So at that point, I almost instantly was an Austrian economist. I was converted. And so I began to read Austrian books and so on, and by the time I graduated, I knew I wanted to go on to a graduate program in economics. And so I did go to Rutgers University in New Jersey, and Murray Rothbard lived in New York City. And I became involved with the New Jersey Libertarian Party. I became the vice president while I was a graduate student. So at one point, before we were going to have our convention, we were going to ask Rothbard to speak, to come across the river and speak in New Jersey. He didn't like to go across rivers for a while. He didn't like to leave Manhattan. Eventually, he got over that sort of travel phobia and traveled all over. But so I went to a conference in New York City to see him speak with the president of the New Jersey Libertarian Party. And it was very interesting. Right prior to Rothbard, there was an individual named Robert Lefebvre, who was a libertarian. He called himself an autarkist. He was an absolute pacifist. He didn't believe you could resist, even if someone attacked you or stole something from you. So when he finished his talk, Rothbard got up there and gave his talk, which was riveting, as Doug said. I mean, he spoke very, very rapidly, but he had so many funny stories, and he was very, very easy to follow. At the end, someone in the question period said, well, what do you think of what Bob Lefebvre just said about not resisting invaders? And Rothbard said, if someone was coming at me with a mallet, I'd plug him. Yeah. So he loved Matt Helm books. Matt Helm was a low-rent American James Bond. Okay, and there was a couple of movies. Dean Martin played in them, and Murray hated Dean Martin for ruining those movies. But anyway, one day when I was in his apartment, when I first got to meet him, he was telling me about this great Matt Helm book that he read. And so he stood up and he said, I learned one lesson from a Matt Helm book. He says, when you come into a room, he says, you burst in, he says, you don't ask any questions, you just start shooting. So he was a funny guy. His taste in literature was like a sort of, he called it a pedestrian taste in literature. That is, he liked crime novels. He loved James Bond movies. When a new one came out, he would see it immediately and then call me about the to discuss the movie. And I'd say, Murray, I haven't seen it yet. Don't give too much away. He was so excitable. But anyway, then following the first time I saw him, I did invite him to come and speak at the Libertarian convention that we had in New Jersey for the party, and he came and he asked. I said, what we can't pay much of an honorarium. I told him, and I was going to offer him $100, $125. And back in the old days, 70s, that was a lot of a medium. I would say intermediate sum of money, not a great deal. But before I could say anything, or before he simply said, just give me $75. I mean, which was unbelievable. And he came over and he spent a lot of time with everyone. But that's when I first met him personally, and I went up to shake his hand and tell him who I was, and we were talking. And then I happened to mention I was a graduate student in economics at Rutgers, and I had read all the Austrian books by that point. And he immediately acted as if I was somebody that, he just had to get to know and had to get into the movement. I mean, I was a nobody. I was a 23-year-old kid. And he, was searching his pockets feverishly for a pen. He always, forgot where he would place his pen. And so finally, I gave him a pen, and he wrote my name down. He said, I'll have someone get in touch with you next week. He said, because there's a reading group, an economics reading group in New Jersey. So after he was done and went back, we shook hands, and I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. But that Monday, the convention was on a Saturday. That Monday, someone called me from this reading group. Richard Fink was his name, and they invited me to attend. And then I attended for a few weeks, and then I was invited to his apartment. Okay, so I was driven over to his apartment on 88th Street on the west side, and he wanted to meet me. He sort of wanted to vet me and see if I had all the right positions. So it was a very hot summer night. There were a few parking lots across the street, and the parking lot attendants were playing the bugle and stuff, and Murray was sitting away from the window. He didn't want to confront them directly, but he kept yelling, "Shut up! Shut up!" So I finally came in, stopped them, and shut the windows and put a fan up. So that was I was waiting for a brick or something worse to come through the window. But anyway, we discussed things until 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, which was early for him. He didn't want me to leave, but I had to get back home. But at one point, we got into a little bit of an argument. We were talking about rioting and looting, and he said that he says shop owners should be able to shoot looters when they're coming to their shops. And I said, not only that, I said if they see them running down the street, they should shoot in the back. So, to get their property back. So Mark said, I don't know if I agree with you there. He says, but I can't have a conversation with someone who's more hardcore than me. So, am I about that? Yeah, let me just, one other story. The first Austrian conference in North America was held in 1974 at South Royalton, Vermont, which actually is not that far from here. And Murray and Israel Kurzner, another Austrian economist, and Ludwig Lachmann, an Austrian economist who had known Hayek and was a generation older than Rothbard, they were all going to be there and be the main speakers. And so it was supposed to be for all Austrians, and there were about 30 graduate students and young PhDs that were invited. And before Rothbard showed up, we were all waiting around talking. Milton Friedman showed up. And for various reasons, which we'll get into in the question and answer period, there was some bad blood between them. But in any case, we were all talking to Friedman and asking him what he thought about Rothbard and so on. And Friedman was extremely exercised and upset because Rothbard had just published a great little article called Uncle Milty, Inflationist, Rides Again in his Libertarian Forum. And that was because Friedman had just come out in favor of not stopping inflation, but indexing contracts so that inflation wouldn't be as bad. Inflation wouldn't have the effects on creditors and debtors, redistributing income. So Friedman was quite upset and angry about that. But anyway, so when Rothbard got there, some of us went over to him, and we were helping him get all his luggage out of the car. He didn't travel light, let's put it that way. Also had a lot of bottles of vodka that we helped unload, which is great. But anyway, he saw that Friedman was there, and he was pretty upset. He says, well, what's he doing at an Austrian conference? Well, we didn't find out until a little bit later. At dinner, one of the organizers of the conference, without telling Rothbard, had invited Friedman, who lived nearby, had a house in Vermont, and he came over, and he gave sort of an introductory talk. And in that talk, he said two things which upset Rothbard and all of the other Austrians in the room. First, he said, you all say you're Austrian economics, or economists. He says, but there is no such thing as Austrian economics or any other kind of economics. There's only good economics or bad economics. So, of course, we were all, boo. And then later on, he told this story about Mises, which I believe is true. At the time, I thought it was just a lie. But it was that when Mises was at the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting with Friedman and Stigler and some other Chicago economists, they were all sitting around. And this was either on the ship over, because they went over on a boat, or it was at the conference. That's not clear from the stories I've heard and from what I've read. But at some point, Stigler and Frank Knight was there. Frank Knight and Friedman were all discussing, along with Mises and Hayek and so on, we're all discussing ways of the tax system. And I don't know if you know or not, but Milton Friedman is the father of withholding. During World War II, he was the one who came up with the idea that if you're going to have really high tax rates, you know, you can't trust the American people to pay the taxes at the end, and he was right about that. But so we should withhold them from each paycheck. Okay, so they were talking about how to make taxes more efficient, or the income tax more efficient, which Mises and other Austrians were very opposed to. That is the very concept of an income tax. I mean, Mises was in favor of taxation. But Mises stood up and stomped out and said, according to Friedman, said, "You're all a bunch of goddamn socialists." Okay? So we all started clapping. Yeah, I mean, Murray was going, "Atta boy, Mises!" He was yelling in his seat. It was great. But later on, Murray leaned over to me and said Mises would never use that language. And in his wife's memoir, she said, I think she reports that he said, "You're all a bunch of socialists." And of course, I mean, income taxation is one of the tenets of Marx's. What am I talking about? Yeah, the Communist Manifesto. Okay, so I don't think he was so wrong about that. But there are other stories I'll relate later on.
Right. Well, you probably noticed that it's first time on the Porcfest I'm wearing a tie, and that's exactly to remember Murray Rothbard, who wore a tie, bow tie, even when he had shorts. And I remember Murray. I was really, at first I read his books, and so I couldn't visualize Murray before I met him. But I thought that he would be, because his books are so uncompromising, so intense, sometimes so harsh. The critique is so harsh, just as he would say, smash them. And so I thought that he should look like kind of something in between Lenin and Stalin. But when I met him first in 1990 at Stanford University, he turned out to be the sweetest person. I'm not making it up. It's the sweetest person I've ever met. He was just so sweet. He was so, so accommodating and whatnot. And at first he had, I think, some problems in pronouncing my last name. So he called me very generously. He called me Mises from Moscow. And he would say, "Where is our Mises from Moscow?" And absolutely right that Joe said that he was working at night. And so at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, he would call the phone would ring. I would take the phone. He would say, "You're hungry. Let's go to Denny's." Yeah. And so I would go to Denny's because I've tried to spend every possible minute, a second with him, because he was just an amazing person. He could play piano very well. He was a very good pianist. He knew literature extremely well. He wrote a couple of plays. One of them read Mozart. Very interesting play about Ayn Rand, where he smashes Ayn Rand. and he was just amazingly nice and sweet person. He had encyclopedic mind. One of his students is David Gordon, who I think inherited this encyclopedic mind. He has hard, but Murray had hard drive, probably 1 trillion gigabytes. He just remembered everything. Once he talked to me saying that the best thing you can do in the United States is to write history of economic thought of Russia, because we don't know anything about who came from Russia. And I was trying to figure out whom should I write about. And then next morning, I'm getting a letter from him, just given to me by the concierge in the hotel, 18 pages long, with a detailed outline, with a story of certain Gennady Skovoroda, an Ukrainian philosopher and economist, of whom I never heard of. But he had this fantastic, absolutely encyclopedic mind. Then Murray was very sweet. He knew that I probably didn't have much money at that time, so he invited me to University of Nevada, Las Vegas. That's where I met Doug first time. and I met Hans Hoppe there. For 2 weeks, I was a visiting professor there. And he and Joey, his wonderful wife, he called her my network. Yeah, where's my network? And they brought me to the casinos, which Murray usually never would go to casinos. But over there, he was jumping with joy. If you will go to casino at that time, the best casino was Mirage. And in Mirage, they had these big tigers and sharks and everything. And he would say, well, this is nice capitalism. Look, I mean, tigers, you want a tiger? And then, and if you would pay enough, they can cook him for you. And so he was extremely nice, had a fantastic sense of humor. And I was blessed to know him and meet him quite often from 1990 to this tragic Monday morning in 1995, in January, when he went to change his glass prescription. He went to change his glass prescription to the eye doctor, and the eye doctor was showing him these tables, in this, to check your vision. And he got so excited that he got a heart attack and died right there. I think that is the best way to go, I would say. It's very spontaneous. It's nothing from central planning. And we had a wonderful memorial service in a Protestant church, which he never go to church, but was a libertarian minister. And after that, Joey invited me and Ralph Rake and Ron Hamovy and other friends of Murray for a dinner. And she had an oversized sense of humor. She was just laughing like mad, saying, can you imagine you go to an eye doctor and the corpse is coming out? And I should probably, she said, you son of a bitch from malpractice, what did he show Murray that he got so excited? And but speaking seriously, Murray was uncompromising intellectual, and he was not dogmatic at all. And I remember, because I've read some Mises, for example, if you will read The Omnipotent State by Mises, in that book he is almost praising United Nations, praising NATO, saying that we should have a universal institution based on the proportional vote and whatnot. Or if you will look at Road to Serfdom, my favorite book, which opened a gateway to freedom for me, but it's very inconsistent. If you will look at chapter 15, welfare state, so you would see that, and he was making fun of them as well. He was just laughing. He said, Mises, can you imagine? Mises had this idea, this fantastic idea, that we should have Chinese Indian majority ruling us here in the United States, because that's what would happen if we have United Nations with a direct proportional vote of everybody. So he was extremely independent in his thinking. Also, Mises was not an anarcho-capitalist. And so I would say that Murray Rothbard also was great in him, that he changed the paradigm of thinking, that he's really created new knowledge, was not just developed, was not just a student of Mises. He didn't like Hayek from the very beginning, at least. I remember I had a tie with Hayek given to me by Chuck Beard, as a professor in California, who was making this Hayek ties. And I got this Hayek tie. And Murray said, what kind of tie is that? This is garbage. Take it off. Yeah. So that was a great pleasure to know him, and I remember him with great fondness. He was it just really, it was for me, that would be one good single reason to defect to United States from anywhere to meet Murray Rothbard.
Okay. You guys did that perfectly. We literally just ended at 2:30 on the dot. So if you guys want to line up and ask questions, let me just ask the first one. Go ahead and line up if you want to get your spot in line. But Doug, can you real quick anecdote about the bomb threat?
Yeah, the first time I really talked to Murray, I was on my way to class at Beam Hall at UNLV, and they had it taped off in yellow police tape. And because it was a crime scene, so I couldn't get into the building, so I went into the cafeteria, and there was Murray sitting there with one of the other students. And so I sat down with him and I said, "What's going on?" And Murray says, "Oh, there's a bomb threat." And I said, "Well, why don't we just send one of the underclassmen in there to find it?" And he goes, "Oh, Douglas, I love the way you think." And we had a relationship from there on out. But if I could add this real quickly, because it illustrates the kind of guy Murray was. You had to write a paper for Murray, 10 pages for every class. You could write it on anything you wanted, but he had to approve the topic. So I went into him and said, "Gee, I want to write on America's Great Depression." He said, "Oh, that's great, Douglas. You might want to, check out this source and that source and this one and that one." And he gave me like 7 or 8 sources. That was what was amazing with him. And then he paused at the end and he said, "Oh, I wrote a book about that too. It's called America's Great Depression." Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Real fast. Just there's one that I want Joe to get it on tape, because he said that I've heard him say it a bunch of times. We don't want to miss it.
Yeah, I was at a number of conferences with Murray, and at night he always wanted to go out. He was a night owl, and when at small conferences, if you're in the middle of nowhere, or Hartford, Connecticut is one place he considered nowhere. Nothing was opened after 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock, and he would say, "What's going on?" He says, "The Industrial Revolution happened 200 years ago. Why is the market closing down?" So he wanted things open all night. So one time we were at a conference of all places, West Point, the military academy, and so it was on I think Cantillon, a sort of pre-Austrian, very good economist from the 1700s, and but after 2 days you're going stir crazy. So Murray wanted to have some entertainment. So I said, "What do you want to do?" And he says, dancing, music, drink. I said, "Okay, I'll go and check at the desk." So I checked at the hotel desk there, and they said, "Well, you're going to have to go, up the mountain, because there's mountains where West Point is, and around the mountain, and there's a place, Newburgh, New York, and they gave me an address, and they said, it's a pretty nice bar, there are dancers there, and so on, go-go dancers." So anyway, we recruited a number of people, and Murray was so happy about this. For a whole hour he was saying, "We're going to go over the wall. We're going to go over the wall, troop." So it's like escaping. He says, "It's so boring. We got to go over the wall." So we got everybody together. We got in the car, and we set off for our destination, and then this almost impenetrable fog settles on the mountain road, and it's very narrow. And so we're talking about, let's turn around, and Murray's going, "Press on, troops, press on!" So when we got there, we went in, and it was actually a kind of a bar that you really don't want to be in if you're not a local. It's kind of a dive bar. And so we were very quiet. We sat in the back, and some of the girls were dancing. And Murray would stand up and clap for each one that danced. Saying, "Murray, they do this all the time. They don't need that applause." But every time they did, people would turn around and look at us, So you don't want these locals in upstate New York looking at you. But so at the end of the whole night, Murray said, "Oh, maybe you want to hang around. Maybe you don't have a ride home." I said, "No, Murray, they have a ride home." But they actually came up, and two of them, they came up to us, and they gave Murray a kiss for cheering them on. So he was a sweet guy. He was a regular guy. He just he wanted to have fun. He wasn't a stuffy academic, though he was a great academic, and he was my mentor and a very close friend of mine.
We're going to me, or we're going to Yuri? I defer to Yuri. No? Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all so much, because, we have his ideas in his books, but it's so great to get a feeling of, Murray Rothbard as a character, and, through stories like this. If you were casting a movie, what actor has the same kind of energy as him? Not necessarily appearance, but who has that vibe that would help us understand what it's like to talk to him? Did I stump the panel?
He was a cross between Robin Williams, because he spoke so rapidly, and an older time guy like maybe W.C. Fields or somebody like that, but somebody who was very jiggly and funny and always moving around. So I'd be hard pressed to figure. There is some old time actor I'm sure I could come up with that that resembled somewhat his mannerisms. But he had very unique and idiosyncratic mannerisms that were very, very appealing.
Maybe
Oh.
Drew Carey. And I only say that because, Drew's a libertarian and maybe a fan and can kind of get that same sort of thing going. But he used to be annoyed when people would say that he looked like Henry Kissinger. Yeah, I mean, that used to really annoy him. And Woody Allen, right? Wouldn't he get that? That would really make him out. He'd go, "Oh my God, Woody Allen is so much older than I am," or whatever he would say. So yeah,
Thank
that would
you.
annoy him.
Yeah, just quickly, I just want to say, I didn't know him obviously, but he just seems like a beautiful, height of humanity and obviously a great mind. And I thank you all for talking about him personally as well. My question just, it seems like anything I want to know about, if I look, I can probably find that Rothbard wrote about it. He was so prolific, like Yuri was saying. He obviously had an encyclopedic mind of a supercomputer that would fill this room, but yet you obviously have personal stories that go with all of that. And I'm just curious, how in the world did he, do so much? I mean, he still had 24 hours in his day like anyone else. I'm just curious how he was able to do that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you could bottle it and sell it, I mean, you'd really have something. But he was a speed reader, for instance, we would hand in our final exams, which were all essay questions, and our 10-page term papers on the same night, last night of class, which was, say, a 7:30 class, got out at 9. He would grade all our papers, all our tests, and be on the red eye to New York that very same night because he didn't want to stick in Vegas one day more than he had to. He wanted to get back to his beloved New York. But how he did it, I have no idea. I think that if he would have been alive during this internet age, I can't imagine him sleeping. He would have ongoing arguments going with who knows who around the world, right?
He once mentioned to me that Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Aristotle, they were insomniacs. And he said, like me. So he was not sleeping at all, I think. He was working. He had this wonderful typewriter, mechanical typewriter, and he was typing. Once I stayed in a hotel room next to his, and I could, during the night, hear this typing and typing and typing and typing. Yeah, so he was such an energetic kind of machine. I mean, it's just unbelievable how productive he was and how, and also I think that Joey, his wife, should be credited for that as well, because he was, she took everything else off his, she was driving him, she was cooking, she was looking how he's dressed, everything else, and he was just focusing on what he definitely had the best comparative advantage.
Yeah, he also got up very late. All his classes at Brooklyn Polytechnic where he taught were in the afternoon, but the first thing he would do when he got up was to watch an old-time soap, and I think it was As the World Turns or General Hospital. And he liked it because it was old-fashioned, that had all WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I mean, he was Jewish himself, and there was hardly anything like a WASP. But he just loved the old-fashioned type of soap opera. So that would start his day off. And he was a genius. There was no other way to describe it. He could write when he had to. He could write something under a deadline. A 10-page paper in 3 or 4 hours. And by the way, if you ever got letters or read his original drafts of his papers, you could tell he never revised. He went through them, had some X's. He revised as he went along. So that was the final draft. So he would insert some words here and there, and he'd have some X's where he crossed out other words. But he would never change the whole, he would never go back and write another draft, and many of us write 4, 5, 6 drafts.
I was just curious, of course he wrote about everything and he was so prolific, but he died suddenly, and I was wondering if any of you knew if he had any other major areas of inquiry to look into, or had any aspects of Austrian economics or libertarianism or whatever that he thought he needed to write about, or any kind of major future projects that we were deprived of by his untimely death? Or would he have just continued to write about everything?
Well, I just know that at the Mises Institute, we have thousands and thousands of pages of his manuscripts that we're still publishing some of them. He wrote a manuscript on science, for example, and government funding of science. He wrote a manuscript on government ownership of and encouragement of recreational areas in the U.S. I mean, things that you would never imagine him writing about, he wrote about. Many of them aren't published. We're going through them and continually publishing them. And of course, he wrote tons of movie reviews, which are just hilarious and funny. And really, actually, if you want to get to know the man and his values, you should look at his movie reviews in a Libertarian Forum. And we're publishing a book I'm helping edit called The Essential Rothbard. We're going to have some of the movie reviews in there and some other things that are a little bit offbeat.
Yeah, I remember he really liked the movie Red Dawn. You read it?
Yeah, he liked Red Dawn. He loved John Wayne. He loved the Godfather movies, those kind of things. But I also know, he wrote the 2-volume History of Economic Thought, and he had written the 3rd volume, except it remained still in his head when he died. So, because he'd only taken it up to essentially Adam Smith, right? 1970s. Yeah, so he had a ways to go. It was all in his head, but Joe's right. And I have a couple letters that I continue to cherish that I received from Murray. And when he wrote, it was just first blast out of the cannon. He got the idea down that he wanted. You might have a little carrot here, adding a word here or there, some things crossed out. But his ability to write and formulate what he wanted to write for a typewriter before the internet age, the word processing age, it's just unbelievable to me.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Well, just first, I'm just reminded of what Yuri said about the 18-page bibliography and what Joe just said about the and about the inserting carrots. And I was listening to Bob Higgs once, and he said that after he wrote Crisis in Leviathan, Rothbard sent him a 20-page letter of citations. He said, "Great book. Here's all the things you should have cited." And then Higgs said he was going through the manuscripts and found a few manuscripts where there was some whiteout. He's like, "Oh, he's a human too, after all." And then Walter Block, I'm at Loyola New Orleans, where Walter Block is one of my professors, and he once had a really good day, he said, where he wrote 10 pages in that day, and he went to Rothbard and said, "Guess what, I wrote 10 pages today, isn't that great?" And Rothbard said, "Yeah, that's what I do every day." But anyway, the question I wondered is, you're probably all too young to know this personally, but maybe you've heard others say anything about it. I've wondered, given what Rothbard's personality was, and given Mises's personality of like the story of you're all a bunch of socialists, or I think there's the story of like he wouldn't talk to Fritz Machlup for 3 years because he suggested floating exchange rates. How did Mises and Rothbard get along non-academically?
From what I know, they got along fairly well. From what Murray himself told me, Murray was really looked up to Mises as a mentor. I mean, as brilliant as Murray was, he thought Mises was one of the greatest economists ever. But he was invited to tea quite a bit with Mises and his wife, and Mises did, see him as a prize student. But they got along, and Murray once said that in his theory of monopoly, which Mises later agreed with, he said, "I would not criticize one word that Rothbard wrote about his theory of monopoly," which was different from Mises, right? Mises said, theoretically, you could have a monopoly on the market that distorts consumer preferences, but Rothbard denied that. But Mises and Rothbard had a little confrontation about that in his Mises seminar, and Rothbard told me that he called him a Schmolerite. And Schmoller was the head of the left-wing historical school in Germany. But he said it was sort of tongue-in-cheek. But they got along on a personal level.
It's also, Murray was asked by I think he got a grant from Volcker Foundation to actually adapt for a college undergraduate studies to adapt Human Action by Mises. And so this project produced Man, Economy, and State. And Mises praised this book in a very uncharacteristic for Mises way, because Mises never praised anybody. And so this time he praised this book, Man, Economy, and State, as a classics of Austrian economics. Then also I lived in Washington, D.C., and I was befriended by Gottfried Haberler. Gottfried Haberler was a student von Mises and was part of these Vienna seminars in the end of 1920s, beginning of 1930s. Then he betrayed Austrian economics, became Keynesian economist, and was teaching macroeconomics in Harvard University. And I met him in Washington, D.C., and we had every Wednesday we would have with Gottfried. He was in his early 90s. We would have lunch, and he worked in American Enterprise Institute. And all the time, he was pretty frail. He would, for example, introduce me, and he would say, "Meet the best Indian economist I've ever met." And then it was Irving Kristol, and he said, "I thought you're Russian." I said, "I thought as well, but he probably knows better." And so he was a very charming, nice gentleman. And then Murray, and I talked to Murray about him, that Gottfried was very interested in what Institute is doing. He thought that he is not welcome there, and on like that. But he was asking, he thought that I'm kind of his sleeper cell in the Mises Institute. And so I talked to Murray about that. And Murray and Hans at that time, they organized special conference because Haberler couldn't travel anywhere. They organized a special conference in Washington, D.C., in which they reintroduced Haberler to the people. And Haberler was great, and he was, I think, 92 at that time. And he just broke in tears. It was just so touching, and how to see how Murray, who wrote a lot of criticism of Hayek, how he betrayed their liberty, and how he was trying to comfort him, and Lou Rockwell was there. It was absolutely wonderful at that time. And then I remember that I asked Haberler at the same, we were sitting at the table at this conference, I said, "Well, Austrian economists, they live long lives." And he said, "Yes, Yuri, because we never lie." He said, "We never lie, that's why we live long lives." And he said, "I have some sins, so maybe I wouldn't live so long." But he lived pretty long. He died 97, Dr. Haberler.
Yeah, I think that although Murray and Mises certainly had different personalities, one thing they shared was this incredible giving of time with their students. And Mises, had very close relationships with all of his students in his Vienna circle, in his Mises circle in Vienna, and Murray developed those same sorts of relationships. And not everybody in academia does that, but both of these gentlemen were just so giving of their time. They were so eager to inspire all of their students, and you can see, I mean, when you see the group of scholars that came out of what Mises created, it's really quite extraordinary.
I once entered the class in September. My first class was, I think, intermediate microeconomics. There was one student, he said, "Are you a true Austrian economist?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to be one." And he said, "Do you know that when Mises would grade everybody he knows A and people he never met B, would that be a grading practice in this class?" And so since then I was trying to find any kind of evidence that that's what von Mises did, but that's what he did.
Yeah, so what von Mises did when he taught as a visiting professor at NYU after he came to the U.S., initially he gave everybody an A in the class, and the dean said, "No, you can't do that." And then after that, he gave anybody who wrote a paper, which was optional, as well as took the exam an A, and then people who didn't write the paper, they got a B. So Mises was a very easy grader, despite the way he wrote, which made him seem very fierce and uncompromising.
I'm going to address this to Mr. Murphy. Several days ago, during your debate with David Friedman, you rather dismissively at one point mentioned the idea about child starvation on Rothbard's, amongst his essays, and you said you weren't going to go into that. What I couldn't figure out is when you're on Friendly Company, why wouldn't you have, after his repeatedly accusing you of not understanding his position on things like macro and rationality, I would have thought that that sort of essay would have been the perfect starting point for you to blow up the idea about Chicago economics, and why you just demurred on that point instead of, even though it's mostly theoretical and I imagine most people wouldn't starve their children, you would have gone with it and, just said on a purely theoretical point, here's how people actually act rather than this, nominal idea about what rationality is. I know you spent most of your time trying to clarify what you meant, and I thought that essay would have been a pretty good job.
Well, we're getting low on time. I mean, afterward, I don't want to make this be about my views on Rothbard and his particular issue on children and so forth. So, I don't know. Maybe they could just have you debate Friedman next year.
Let me. I want to clarify something about that point in Rothbard where he says, you can withhold food from your children. I asked him about that, and what he said was, well, you can't secrete them in a closet and not feed them. That's murder. He said, if you don't want to give them any more resources, you've in effect given up guardianship. So he said to me, you should at least put them on the steps of a church or something like that. So he was just spinning out the logical implications. But he didn't. He had a theory of guardianship. That is, that you could abdicate the guardianship rights, and the only way you could do that was by sort of leaving them for someone else.
I was just wondering if any of you had any juicy gossip about the Cato controversy that he ever dished to you. If not, never mind.
No, I don't think. I think it was. Oh. You go ahead. All right. What started the rift, I mean, such as it was, and I think it's been overblown through rumor and innuendo, but what started the rift was when Cato hired an economist who Rothbard had nothing against personally, but who was a Chicago economist. And Rothbard thought that the agreement was that this was going to promote Austrian economics. So that started the rift, and then later on, Rothbard was a stockholder. It was a very different kind of foundation in that it had stockholders, and so you could if you had the majority, you could have voted Rothbard out of Cato through a meeting of the board of the organization, but that meeting never took place, and Rothbard had left his stock certificate in a safe at Cato with the other ones, and they just took the certificate. So there was a lawsuit there for a while, but it was getting very costly, and Rothbard never made a lot of money, so he dropped the lawsuit. But that's what it was. That's how it started.
Well, and I think this had a little bit to do with, Murray was very uncompromising on his view of war, and the Cato Institute, shall we say, at least at the time, maybe still is a little more sympathetic to, the imperial aggressions of the United States government. So I think that Murray fell out to some degree because of that. But you can see that, I think Murray is published in the Cato Journal, into the mid-80s, more or less. So. Again, I mean, you can hear various stories on this, but I agree with Joe. It's a little bit overblown and probably a little bit of a philosophical, split and just a business decision. Probably not a very kind one, but probably not as big a deal as people want to make out.
If I may have a kind of a sales, we brought a lot of books. This Requiem for Marx, when Murray wrote a wonderful piece called, the title of the piece is Karl Marx as Religious Eschatologist. It's a wonderful essay, as well as essays by Paul Gottfried, by Hans Hermann Hoppe and whatnot. And so we will have a fire sale of this book. So if anyone is interested, then we'll drop the price from $18 to $10, not to drive them back to Wisconsin. Then also, I think that also speaking about Murray, it was very vibrant intellectual atmosphere around him. I remember people like Bert Blomert or Justin Raimondo, or I remember we had a conference in Atlanta in the hotel in Hilton at the airport, and we were walking down the street, down the corridor in Atlanta hotel, and there's Patrick Buchanan is going against us. And Pat Buchanan stopped and began to talk to Murray, and then we see, and I couldn't believe it, Mr. Farrakhan is coming out. And Murray began to laugh like there is no tomorrow. He said, "Can you imagine what kind of conspiracy is that?" Yeah. And that was really very funny. And amazingly now that Mr. Farrakhan, I don't think he knew Murray, but he knew Mr. Buchanan and stopped to chat with him. Yeah, so that was pretty interesting sometimes. They were just beautiful, wonderful people, the people around Murray. Lou Rockwell was the one who I think who made him shine. I mean, he created von Mises Institute, of which Murray was a vice president for academic affairs for almost all time I knew him. He was a spirit behind the von Mises University, and I think that those of you who never visited Auburn University, I think that you should. It's a highlight of your life to go to the von Mises University in the summer. It's a beautiful, wonderful courses. Besides that, in the institute also the African scholar, the Austrian. No, I was introduced as Australian economist, so I became confused. So the Austrian Scholars Conference every month is something. It's a place to be as well. It's fantastic conference.
I just had a really quick question. One thing I found of value with Murray Rothbard is that through his research on history, he realizes that there's a cui bono, that someone benefits. And my question is regards to, he actually did delve into what some people today would call conspiracy theory with Wall Street, the banks, and American foreign policy. And I really appreciate his work because I work with others to kind of go into history and see all those connections and so forth to understand why things happen. Question being, did he get a lot of flack for going into those areas as being called the so-called conspiracy theorist?
Yeah, he did, and unjustly so, because almost every economist, free market economist, including the Chicago School, would agree that if you suddenly see tariffs on steel or something like that, you go back and you look and you figure it's the steel industry that's conspiring to reduce supply, foreign supply, and increase prices. No one would object to that. What caused Murray to get as much flack is that he applied that theory to a hallowed institution. Of course, guess what that institution is? The Federal Reserve System. So that's why they called him a conspiracy theorist. But he was doing nothing different than showing that when any industry gets power from government, it is lobbying for that power, okay? And that's true of the banks. But the Chicago School, for example, refuses to admit that, okay, as well as many other free market economists. So you might want to call it a conspiracy theory. I just think it's a motivation theory, that there are motives for things happening in our world, especially by government.
Also, he used this famous Lenin's dictum happily, and the dictum was, at any time we should find out whom. He used to say, whom here. Yeah, and that was, then another kind of thing was, he used to say, several times at least, I'm quoting him from time to time, he would say, I'm not following conspiracy theories, but the conspiracies happen all the time. Left and right, mostly left. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to pile onto that because this is really the way he taught his class. When he taught his class, if you can imagine, he's talking economics, but there was always good guys and there was bad guys. And that's what made his classes so interesting. And you can call it conspiracy theories if you want, but that's what made his classes come alive so much. And by the way, when he taught history of economic thought, he changed the theme every semester. So when I took the class, little did I know, I was one of the few people taking it for credit. Everyone else in the class had already taken it before. They just knew they were going to get a new version of history. And if you want to get what essentially his lectures were, buy the 2-volume History of Economic Thought, because that's those are essentially from his lectures from his semesters there at UNLV. Thanks, guys.